Hello again, Wonkyfied people and Wonkyfied Nation, if we're that big yet. Probably not. It's me, Rob, again. Paul's here
Hi.
with Well, how you doing? So we are finishing up. This is the final episode. We're still in season two, and we've gone through several topics, all kind of around nerd culture. And we've spent, gosh, what, 5 episodes on heroes,
Yeah.
right? And so we've talked about, Paul, we've talked about certain types of heroes. We start with we obviously had the Joseph Campbell model, the
Right.
trajectory, the timeline, the process, the hero process.
Yep.
And then we talked about, we used what would you call it? The profile, the stereotype of the hero, the light hero,
The archetype, I think it's what
the
Campbell would say.
archetype is perfect. Just the person who aligns their heroic nature with a sense of doing things the right way.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then we looked at the dark hero, who is more, and I guess example of let's give examples.
Mm-hmm.
Like hero, in American culture, Superman,
Yep, that's what our example.
dark hero. And obviously there's some other examples too.
Oh yeah.
And then of course the classic dark hero example is Batman.
Batman.
It's the same sacrificial attitude that the light hero has, but does not have I'm going to do the right thing the right way. I'm going to do the right thing, whatever it takes.
Yeah, whatever it takes. Yeah.
And some of that being violence and blood and nasty gore. Okay, so you got that. And then you have the anti-hero who, and we talked about spaghetti westerns, and the anti-hero is someone who doesn't have that sacrificial heroic element at all, but just kind of backs into it.
Yeah.
And it either backs into it, and I've seen some great documentaries on this, they either back into it or it's there.
Mm-hmm.
They just don't want anybody to know about it.
Yeah.
It exposes a weakness. And I've that, and it's hard to tell. Obviously those who have this Italian imprint on them, and obviously they become very American, but so it's there's a lot of depth there to all of these like that. Final one is, okay, we're kind of going back to number one, this perfect, the perfect archetype, but fallen.
Yeah.
And so now, and the fallen example was, obviously there's some examples of Superman and fallen, but what was the classic example we gave for that? Do you remember
I don't remember which one we had. We had several that we were floating around.
Right.
That were good examples of this fallen hero, someone who was once in a state of grace and then was removed from that place.
Of course, usually they get back too.
Yes, do an act of redemption, which is something we talked about also last episode.
So now we're looking at the Christ, like the biblical narrative, and Christ's redemption at the Hall of Faith, because the Hall of Faith, we look at the Hall of Faith as just this collection of people who were, whose accomplishments were heralded, who we would think of as probably the number one category, right? The archetype.
Yep.
But weren't all archetypes. And if they were, they fell.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very much, and when we talk about Campbell's arc, I don't want to say Campbell's arc is, the same as narrative arc.
Right.
But the boat arc is the same as the heroic arc that God provides for us. But there is that, that sense that we must all fall, right? For God's power and for everyone to understand that it's God's power that's making this happen. And so that's a big part of the narrative arc of the heroes, and the faith, heroes of faith. So why don't you take it from there? Tell us a little bit about that. Where we can find this, what the point of this passage, and then we're going to look at, I think, 3 examples.
Yeah. So when we talk about the Hall of Faith, most people, out there in our viewing audience may not know what we're talking about. We're talking about Hebrews 11. The book of Hebrews in the New Testament, chapter 11, starts off with this great definition of what faith is. This idea that faith is being assured of what we cannot see. And that's important because as we think about, and of course, in modern epistemology, what does it mean to know something? What does it mean to have knowledge? Most of the time the kind of the more common definition, they call it JTB, justified true belief. You need to have a justification, a truth part of it, some type of lethic statement, and then a belief to back those things onto. And there's some other nuance in there, but just for our understanding, I mean, faith is different from that. Faith falls into a kind of a different framework. You may have justification to your faith, but you still don't know that your faith is true. And that's the important part. Like I said, Hebrews 11 starts off, I'm just going to quote it here from the ESV. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And so the writer of Hebrews begins with that and then systematically walks through the patriarchs of the Hebrew faith that the Christian faith is built on, and starts laying out historical examples of how these patriarchs followed in faith the promise that God had laid out for them, the promise of becoming Messiah, the promise of redemption, the promise of salvation through his restoration. And so we have this great example of these as they walk through. But before we get to that, there's something you said I really want to go back to if I can. You said something that was really interesting about how there's a certain part of the human condition that has to be fallen, or something to that effect. And there's a great philosopher, guy named Alvin Plantinga. Some of the people out in our viewing audience have heard of him.
Well, they pronounce it Plantinga.
Plantinga.
They've seen it, because I have a book in my reading shelf that David Noggle suggested. So Plantinga. So yeah, and I think most people pronounce it
Plantinga
incorrectly.
But Plantinga had he wrote a paper called "O Felix Culpa," or Happy Fall. And this was he didn't like theodicies, which is basically just an argument, a very well-structured argument that explains the prevalence of evil and why God and evil can exist at the same time. He generally shied away from those, but he did write one, and this is what he called it. And O Felix Culpa is just Latin for "O Happy Fall." And his argument ties beautifully to what you're saying, this idea that God knew that the best world that he could create was one in which humanity had free will. Well, because there is free will, there has to be the chance of a fall, of going south.
You mean the probability?
There has to be something there. God, he couldn't make automatons and demand us to only do one thing and at the same time give us complete free will. Those two things are logically incompatible. And so for God to create a completely free agent, as we are, or we believe that we are, he knew that he had to know that there was the chance that it could go awry. And so when we look at this, now kind of going back into this hall of faith, as we're walking through the hall of faith, seeing these portraits being painted by the writer of Hebrews, we can conjure up the stories, walking through Genesis, Exodus, First Kings, all these judges, these people that were supposed to have stayed the course, but ultimately, most all of them had some grievous flaw. I mean, we look at people like Abraham, of course, kind of the patriarch of the Hebraic faith. Abraham lied to Pharaoh, and then, of course, was offered from his wife, his handmaiden, instead of following God's chosen plan for his life. Instead, kind of took the easy way out, fathered a child outside of the promise, with Ishmael. We have Moses, who killed a man. We have, one of the ones we're going to talk about later, David, who, of course, was a man after God's own heart, but yet also committed adultery and murder. So this whole list is really a list perpetrating that example of free will leading to some type of fallen self. But what's beautiful about this, and what we're going to talk about here in just a second, is how the writer of Hebrews lists them in this place of elevation because there was a sense of redemption in the life of these characters. And he writes it at the end of Hebrews 11. He says that now they died looking forward to the promise. They never saw it, but they looked forward in their life to the promise, and they did so through faith. And that faith, as the writer of Hebrews ends out Hebrews 11, because of this, then he begins in chapter 12 with saying, since you then have such a great cloud of witnesses, you therefore run your race well.
Yeah. So here's my question. And this is, we're talking about heroes. So the first question is, if we're looking at these folks as a group, then we kind of, you can take it any way you want. I'm going to give you some questions, and then you can apply those corporately to the Hall of Faith members.
Yeah.
Everyone has a bust in Canton, the Jesus Canton, whatever you want to call it. Everyone is in the Hall of Faith.
Yeah.
Or you can say, I want to talk about my select few David and what have you that I want to talk about. Either way you want to do it. So, what makes them heroes?
Okay.
Because we've been talking about heroes, we're talking about what establishes a hero, we're talking about the ark, whatnot. So, what makes them heroes? Why did they fall? What intrinsic weakness caused that?
Okay.
And then I'm going to have a third question, but let's start with those two.
Okay. Well, I think that definitely two examples that I want to bring up. Probably the first one, because I think that these two specifically fit the great, the kind of that Campbell arc the best. And obviously, like you said, the Campbell arc it's not divinely inspired. It's not like we're trying to apply it to the Bible. However, Campbell, in looking at the narratives of the world, including the biblical narrative, saw similarities. So I don't think we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say it doesn't have some application. Yeah. But for our readers out there, please hear, we don't take this as like gospel or anything, but it's a good barometer. But I think the two that really match this the best, I think, are Samson and David. Okay. Samson, probably one of my favorite stories in the Bible. Now, let's be clear. For those who've never read the book of Judges, it's a harrowing account. Being a youth minister, it's one of the hardest books to try to walk through with your students, but you don't avoid it because it's in the Bible, and it's a very important part of the history of the children of Israel. But of course, Samson comes right toward the end. He's kind of like that culmination of just how wicked things can get. Samson was a heinous dude. But what's interesting with Samson is he had this supernatural origin, very similar. Kind of go back to my world of comics, this idea of, the comic superhero with Campbell, with this idea of the divine calling out of kind of mundanity. He had this supernatural origin. His mother couldn't have kids or was barren. She was told by an angel that she would bear a child and that he would begin to save his people from the Philistines. Of course, the Philistines, historically, Canaanite, very wicked people, pagan, occupying many of the lands that God had promised the children of Israel. And they were constantly at war with these people. Anyways, of course, she gives birth to Samson. He was set apart. So now we have, again, following that Campbell arc, this set of guidelines that is imparted by this kind of wise mentor. In this case, it was, an angel of the Lord saying he had to be a Nazirite from birth. A Nazirite was a specific ideology. I don't want to say sect, but a specific ideology that he had to follow. No unclean things. So, of course, no dead things, nothing unclean, no alcohol, and he could not cut his hair. Now, what I think is interesting here is most people, when they think about Samson, they really kind of look at this one aspect, the whole hair aspect, as very magical. Like
that's really the focus.
Yeah, his hair had some, and I think it's let's be honest. I really think a lot of it deals with VBS, kind of VBS culture, where you got the cute little Samson who's, fighting a lion in a headlock, and he's got this long flowing hair. We kind of try to dumb it down in some ways. And I don't think that's wrong. It's just, that's the culture. But the reality is, God could have said, hey, don't eat cake mix on Thursday. And the minute he ate cake mix on Thursday, God removed his power because he broke the promise. The hair just was whatever God chose to be the symbol of his promise. So fast forward, Samson now has supernatural strength, right? This is what we know about Samson, right? Supernaturally strong. So again, you have this blessing, kind of following the Campbell line, this blessing given to the hero, something that sets him apart. And then he goes on this journey, right? And in Samson's case, he's kind of tugged by his own lusts and desires, has a strong problem with women. So he just kind of follows women around. Yeah. He goes over to marry a Philistine woman. And along the way, he's attacked by a lion. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. This is Judges, I think, 14. Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he literally ripped a lion in half, just killed it barehanded. So obviously powerful, obviously supernaturally, generated power. And he could have been, and this is where I think this hero story really is fascinating. He could have been truly something just remarkable beyond what his story just was.
Yeah.
But because of his sin nature, because of his own desires, and frankly, because of the hubris that came with, I have power, I don't have to follow the rules, he allowed himself to break time and time again that covenant. First thing he did, he came across the dead lion. Another time, he scooped honey out of it. Of course, touching dead things made him unclean. Therefore, he broke that one. Then offered it to his parents with them unknowing. He drank at his party, got completely inebriated, made a drunken promise to some of the suitors, and then went and killed people to fulfill that promise. But even through all of that, God stayed his hand. He stayed with him. It wasn't until he finally allowed himself to be duped and I think the Bible says vexed to the point of wanting to die, annoyed by Delilah, as to know the secret to his strength. He finally told her the truth that if you cut my hair, that's it. Basically, God pulls himself from me. And so she did. He was captured. And what's really interesting, if you know anything about, of course, ancient history, he was a warrior. That's what the judges were. The judges were these warrior class, these people risen up by God to be these champions. Well, if you cut a hand or a foot off a warrior, they're still viable. They may, have issues, but that's why we have pirates with hooks and peg legs and things like that. But if you blind a warrior, you've literally reduced him to nothing. And that's ultimately what they did to Samson. They blinded him and they put him in the tombs or in the prisons there, grinding grain, which was something reserved for not only females, but also slave labor. And then they would bring him out and have him entertain them. More than likely, they would, assault him from all sides. And of course, he couldn't see, and they would find it funny to see him flailing about.
Yeah.
So humiliated. And so we see this arc, right? So let's kind of follow the Campbell trajectory. Supernatural origins, sent on a path and a journey, given some type of supernatural ability that set him apart. But this is where the fallen hero really kind of comes sharp, right? The virtuous hero carries his trajectory one way. The dark hero maybe carries it hooks a little bit, but it stays on that same trajectory. The anti-hero just kind of goes through it backwards. They don't realize they're in it.
Right. They just get, either they don't realize it or they try to suppress it.
Yeah, they try to suppress it, but somehow they get to the end. It's the fallen hero that at some point, this thing drops off.
Right.
And this is where we find Samson at the end of Judges. And I want to go back to, because this is where I think he belongs in the Hall of Faith. I've actually argued that I think he truly does belong here. If you remember, when we started this, in Judges 13, when Samson is told, or when he's being told, his parents are being told that he's coming, they said he will begin to save his people from the Philistines. That was his purpose. Well, we know in Samson's death in Judges 16, he asked to be brought to the pillars that hold up the temple of Dagon, where there's 3,000 Philistines there watching him. And so he rests on the pillars and he prays that God would give him strength one last time, not even to glorify God, which I think is so funny. It just, let me get vengeance for my eyes.
Let me just kill them all. Yeah.
Let me just end them all. But God gives him strength one last time. And it's interesting. The Hebrew word, it translates as he pushed, but the Hebrew word references a wrenching, like he literally ripped the pillars down. He didn't just push them out. He like ripped them down, and he ripped the pillars down, crashed the whole temple, killing himself, but killing 3,000 Philistines. Now, up until this point, Samson was a wrecking ball. I mean, he just was slaying people left and right. He killed 1,000 people with the jawbone of a donkey. He killed, and the Bible says he killed more in his death than he had in his life. He made a major, major detriment to the Philistine nation, because these were the leaders of the Philistines at the time in one of their major cities, in one of their major temples. And so his life truly fulfilled the purpose. Which is why I think that we can say he was redeemed. Now, was he redeemed in a salvific sense? Which is why I think it was important we talked about that last time. I don't know. I don't want to say yes, but I think his life was redeemed. He was no longer valueless. When he was there in prison as a fallen hero, that was where his story could have stopped.
Yeah.
But as we find with these fallen heroes, there's often a sense that they get put back onto that track and they carry that Campbellian kind of arc out.
Yeah, and it's weird because he's certainly not a light hero. He doesn't. Yeah, I don't know which category you'd put him in. I don't know if he's a dark hero or not, because you're not even sure that he's fighting for the right reasons.
No. I mean, I think if we had to categorize him against one of our own, he definitely is a fallen hero, but they're kind of a subcategory. I would say he's an anti-hero in that he came upon his heroic arc somewhat accidentally. But it's interesting. And of course, this is the beauty of God's providence. He still fulfilled the arc, despite his best efforts to not, he still fulfilled it.
And the spaghetti westerns, they're anti-heroes. They go through that similar, and I think Samson's an origin for this. The story of Samson or his life is an origin for it. Maybe he's the fastest person in the draw. Maybe he's got a whip, or there's all sorts of things that they may have, and at some point they lose that.
Yeah. Like
one Django, he gets his hands bloodied, so he's so fast on the draw, and he can just boom, boom, boom. It's almost supernatural. Like he can shoot, he can figure out somebody's behind him, and go, boom, boom, and can kill him like that. But the opposition destroys his hands. He can't shoot, so he has to figure out another way to do it. And so it's kind of similar to Samson in that regard. So I could see this anti-hero, and again, we don't. The difference is in the anti-hero, they usually get caught up in a noble cause.
Right. Which it was. As we look historically, obviously the Philistines were causing a lot of problems for God's people, the nation of Israel there in the promised land. And I just can't get away from that phrase, he will begin to save his people. Now, what's interesting, the next person we're going to talk about is David. David wrestled with the Philistines as well. Of course, Goliath and the Philistine army, that was, part of that whole thing. It wasn't even David that saved his people from the Philistines. It was actually a later descendant of Hezekiah, I believe it was, that ultimately put an end to the Philistine army. But this one act really set the pace, because had this not happened going into the end of the judge period and into the reign of the monarchy, at the end of Judges, we have a time right after that where Saul is called. And so Saul is wrestling with the Philistines. David is wrestling with the Philistines. But had Samson not done this one thing, I think you could argue the fact that the Philistine army would have continued to grow in strength to the place that the Israelites couldn't even contend with them.
So was it a loss of strategic might, that the 3,000?
I think it was. I mean, this was the Temple of Dagon, so they're one of their prime deities. Right. This was in, if I'm not mistaken, I think he was in Gath at the time. So this is one of their major cities. This was kind of the leaders of the Philistine army. There's 3,000 of them. The ones who were the movers and shakers of the Philistine nation were there. And they even said, the Bible records them saying, they praised Dagon, thanking their God for delivering their enemy into their hands. And so what's really fascinating, and this is what I've kind of told my students, Samson's story on one level is a story of us as human beings and how not to interact with sin, right? On one level, it's about the danger of arrogance and just playing with sin, kind of like a cat plays with string.
Which is what he did.
Exactly what he did. But there's multiple levels. And on another level, really, it's about the significance, the strength, and the, aseity, the uniqueness of Yahweh God in this sea of false gods. Right. As the Philistines praised Dagon, this false god, for bringing their enemy into their hands, we on this side of history can look back and say, absolutely not. You brought God's agent into your area, basically, and invited you into God's hands, essentially what's happened.
Yeah.
Which again is what I think is so significant about his place in the Hall of Faith. His life was redeemed. Soul, don't know, depending on how we take the harrowing and things like that. Maybe when, Jesus presented himself, maybe he followed. I don't know. But I think it's significant that we can't just kick him out, for that reason. But let's move on to David, because David, I think, is another good example. Again, supernatural calling. When Samuel is told to come up and anoint the next king, you have this one boy that's set apart. Everybody else is paraded in front of him. And he's thinking, oh, well, it's got to be one of these people. But God, of course, says, I look at the heart, not on the outside, that great passage. And so you have this set apart, almost Arthurian example, right? This young boy, very much kind of like King Arthur,
sword in the stone,
nondescript, pulled out and set apart to be this great king. Then he has his moment, right? His kind of heroic moment where he is presented with the opportunity to fight Goliath, right? That's insurmountable odds. This is his test. This is his challenge. This is where he goes in a boy and comes out a king. This is where the legend is built, right? As Campbell would kind of put it. And so we have, the example where he chooses his weapons well. He only needs one stone, which I think is so great. Yep. He faces Goliath. He shows up and exemplifies that heroic attitude of strength, of courage. You may be great, but this day God will deliver you into my hands. And what's so interesting is, if you know anything about the Hebrew, the word that is used when Goliath calls out your champion, right? This word is the in-between man, basically the man who stands in between the armies and fights on behalf of the army. And so Goliath is calling out, who among you is man enough to represent your whole army against me? And so that's a big deal. And so for them to send this teenage boy with no armor, with just a sling and some stones, that's significant. And so, the legend of David from that point on is cemented. He is this anointed, blessed king. And we see this great arc, right? So he's following this virtuous trend. So Samson's kind of going this way, and somehow or another, he just picks up and gets brought back up here.
Right.
David's rocketing on. He's going on it.
He's got the trajectory.
He's got the trajectory, fighting the Philistines, saving Saul, even though he could have killed Saul,
he shows so much. There's the character there, and
absolutely,
the way he acted in his relationship with Jonathan, and how he could have killed him. Just mercy, grace. So
much character in him. I mean, following that virtuous trend.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's so interesting about David, and this is why I think David resonates so well with us today, and I think with the Israelite people, which is why I think they've held him to such a high standard.
Oh, yeah.
They recognize that David is that perfect, I think, example of us as humans. He's following this virtuous trend, and I think what makes his story so significant is it wasn't a slow grade into darkness. It was a sharp, just cut off.
As far as we could tell.
As far as we could tell, yeah. I mean, according to the biblical record, it was this sharp cutoff. It was 2 Samuel, I think 11, 2 Samuel 11, where David is now, he chose to, when other kings are out at war, he'd stayed back. And so he's walking around his temple, or not his temple, sorry, walking around his palace. Of course, we know the story. He sees Bathsheba, lusts after her, desires her, brings her over. She gets pregnant. And so now he has to deal with this. And so not only has he committed adultery, he now has to deal with the child, the evidence of it. And so he tries to guile and convince Uriah the Hittite, who's the husband of Bathsheba, to stay behind or maybe kind of make it seem like, oh, this could be your kid.
Like they were there, and she could have got pregnant. Yeah.
But the once virtuous hero is now out virtued by his underling, by Uriah. He says, no, I can't leave my men. I won't do that. And so ultimately, David now has to take that step off the cliff and fall into darkness when he instead orders him to the front of the lines and then for everyone to pull back and basically sacrifice Uriah. And that could have been David's story, right? At that point, we could have now been talking, okay, now we're following Samson again. But what's really beautiful about David is just like in the fallen hero storyline, there comes a point where the fallen hero has to step back to the light. Otherwise, they become the villain, right?
Yeah.
They're at a crossroads. There's a great line in, is it The Dark Knight? I think it's The Dark Knight, the Christopher Nolan movie, The Dark Knight, where Aaron Eckhart's character, Harvey Dent, says either you, hang on, I got to get the quote right. Basically, it says something to the fact of you stay a hero long enough, or you live to see yourself become the villain. Basically, right. I know I'm butchering it.
Or something like that, because it's about death. You either die as a hero.
That's it.
Or you live long enough to become a villain.
That's it. Yes. And so we see this, and look at Samson. Samson didn't really die a hero. He had been a villain, but he at least turned in that prayer, right? It showed him turning back to God. For whatever reason, he at least turned back.
At least he recognized his power, God's power.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That he can't do it without God.
And he always recognized that his power, the source of his power.
Right.
Which is because I think one of the things that we see from David is he starts forgetting that. And that's when you're king.
Yep.
When you're responsible for this and all of this, and people look to you, and no one ever, the entire country is yes men,
Yep.
So you kind of get that, I can do anything I want.
And so you had this great moment, like I said, in the arc of this fallen hero, where he has to come to this crossroads. Do I basically die either physically or proverbially a hero, or do I continue on this path and become a villain? And so we see Nathan confront him, the prophet Nathan. He presents him with a story, and basically calls him out. Now, the king, like you said, could have easily said, how dare you, off with his head, kill him.
Yeah.
But instead, what makes David so special is he immediately realizes it.
Now, one of my favorite stories is it Shmi? Is that the guy who's like David's walking along and a guy is going, this is after obviously post Bathsheba, and he was a known enemy, not an enemy, like a rival, maybe.
Yeah.
He was aligned with David's rivals, political rivals. And he starts just screaming at him, screaming, you jerk, you did this, you did this, you did this. And one of David's men goes, usually it could be like, like these days, be like, do you want somebody just to tell him to shut up? And then it was, you want us to just go kill him? And
Yeah.
because, basically, if that's the worst consequence after what I've done, I'll take it.
Yeah.
That's not, I shouldn't, that. And so David recognizes, and that's the heroic nature. He recognizes he made a mistake.
Absolutely. When Nathan confronts him and he realizes that I have sinned against God, and he asks for forgiveness, and then Nathan pronounced, and this is kind of where I think the fallen hero trajectory goes different. Virtuous hero, dark hero, they kind of follow up, right? One goes more steep up, one still curves, but it follows. Anti-hero follows the arc, but kind of does it without it knowing it. Follow hero follows off. It gets restored,
Right.
but there's always something there to remind that hero of their fallenness. And so in the case of David, it was the pronouncement that the son would die, or the child would die, that came from the union, and that strife, or the Bible says the sword, but strife and dissension would never leave his house. And what we see is that played out. I mean, the children of David.
That's not the only child that suffered.
No, more children came out of that. Obviously, we have Solomon later on down the line of kings. But I mean, between Adonijah and Absalom and all the other sons of David that had all this infighting and murder and
rebel against him. Yeah,
absolutely. And David dies basically accepting the fact that this was of his doing. We get this kind of feeling as we're reading into First Kings that this is, his doing. This is what just happened, But I think it's interesting that David is held to such a high standard. Why do they hold David up to the standard that they don't hold Samson? Well, I generally believe, one, David was a king, Samson wasn't, so that plays into it. But even beyond that, I think that we resonate with David more in the desire to be restored. Samson, I think we expressly reflect more in our own sin nature. David is that example of the fallen hero that's restored to a place that we want to be. He's still considered a man for God's own heart.
Samson's restoration was instantaneous. The restoration was he died.
Yep.
So we really don't want to identify with that. Oh, okay, that's great. He's dead. And David still lived on. I mean, now he would probably tell you, if you ever get the chance to talk to him, that his life after that, in many ways, had a fate worse than death.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, the family. I mean, I can't imagine, and all that, and that heartache upon heartache, the grieving, with all the sons, and but he did still, he was still king, and he still had, he still did things that were heroic and were, that honored God, but it probably wasn't much fun after that. So
no, but what I think is so interesting is the legacy of David. Right. We can often look at that, like you said, that point after and say, yeah, look at all the things that happened afterwards. I mean, yeah, he's still king. He probably still had some good things. I think probably one of the best things, honestly, that came out of his kingship after that point, which is the transverse of power to Solomon, really. But the true legacy of David, I think, is Psalm 51. That psalm that was recorded, most people believe, probably around that time, that week when he's praying for the son or the child to live. And when David records this, we get the most beautiful example of what it means to truly be broken in spirit. This is why the hero is restored. He doesn't come at it from his own power, his own will. He knows, I can't do this. I am not who I was supposed to be. This is not the path I was supposed to take. And so in acknowledging that, especially in the sense, in the Christian sense to God, God restores him.
Right.
There's still consequences, but God still restores him. And I think that's why David's story is so beautiful. If it wasn't for Psalm 51, I mean, yeah, we'd have that, I have sinned against God. We know he repented and he tried to make things right. But we have this great example, I think is the true legacy of David, is Psalm 51, that example of what it means to truly be broken and to seek that redemptive aspect that pulls all of us as fallen people
Right.
back into the right arc.
And I think also we always think of David as a man of peace and as a man of virtue.
Mm-hmm.
It's different from Samson, but the one connection they have is they're both warriors.
Yep.
And I mean, David was the blood king,
mm-hmm.
right? England's had their share of blood. He was not. And so, like, they talk about the mighty men and how his mighty men were just, very strong. There's some interpretations that they were basically thugs, that they were not, they were not as virtuous as David was. So we have to, I mean, he's got blood on his hands to the point that God says, you're not, and this is, I mean, I don't think Bathsheba or no Bathsheba, he was not building the temple.
No. Yeah. That's another great example.
So that's another part of his arc that we need to remember, that he killed a lot of people. Yeah. And so that now God told him to, mm-hmm. and that he also had to deal with. I would think at some point, especially if he's intelligent enough and had self-awareness enough to be a king and a leader, that he had to deal with that as well, and just sort of in his life think of, because we just kind of take it for granted because they're fun little stories, but I mean that was his life.
Well, and think about, and you brought something up that's really interesting. Think about, as we look at Samson and David compared, and of course, the Hall of Faith is full of people. We could go through all of them, but right. Just taking these two, we've talked about where does the redemption point come? And then ultimately, what is their legacy? Well, in Samson's case, his redemption point came, like you said, when he died, when he surrendered, when he realized he couldn't do it on his own. He gave his will back to the Lord, asked for strength, died in the process, but fulfilled his original promise, fulfilled what his life was meant to be. His life was no longer wasted. It had a purpose. That purpose was to set the nation of Israel up to ultimately defeat the Philistines later on. But what about David? What was David's purpose? I think you could really argue by looking at the fact that he didn't build the temple. The man after God's own heart didn't build the temple because he had blood on his hands. The man after God's own heart failed miserably, but ultimately left us an artifact by which we can use. I mean, Psalm 51 is just, it's the perfect example of what it means to have a broken, as he says, a broken, contrite heart and ask for redemption from a place of just desperation.
Yeah.
I would say that David, his legacy is truly that of just an example. This great king, right, that did all these things at the front end and all these, all this kind of darkness that followed him on the back end. His arc was meant to be an example. He didn't build the temple. He didn't defeat the Philistines. He changed the course of history to some degree, but I think that is really the point of David. That was his purpose. That was his life. And it's weird for us to think this great man, his whole purpose was just to be an example. But we have biblical examples of this. I mean, think about the man in the New Testament when he's, I think he's born blind, and the disciples are there with Jesus, and they says, who sinned, him or his father, that he would be in this place? And Jesus said, this man is here so that the will of God can be magnified and shown. I don't know how often we think about the fact that it could be the case that human being was put there specifically for this moment.
Well, and I think that's the point of David. And obviously, I mean, we haven't gotten into the covenant, lineage, his true, and that's one thing. When we talk, and I think we wrap this up by talking about how Christians live, as how they pursue their own heroic narrative arc, and ultimately that comes down to living out God's purpose for your life. And that sounds easy. It's simple. It is simple, but it's hard.
Yeah.
And there's this, and like David, like Samson, we have a series of tests, and the number of tests that we choose to engage generally indicates how far we take God's purpose. And so that's when I think of these two, I think about how many tests that they're willing to undertake and how far they took God's purpose in their lives.
Absolutely. And, again, as we wrap this up, as we think about, where does this leave us practically? Well, I think we can see ourselves throughout all these people. And I think just like them, we follow that same seeking a heroic arc of our own. It's almost like like the carnival of darts, they're it's almost like they're weighted. They never truly make it there. No matter how strong we think we are, we never get there. They always have that arc that should be going this way, always curves. And so the only thing that we have is the same thing that these people, I think the writer of Hebrews is trying to point us to, that it took something beyond themselves, faith in something beyond themselves. Right. They died seeking that promise. That is what it takes. As Christians, we talked about what it means to have a Christian sense of redemption. We trust Jesus Christ. We follow after him. We know that only in him do we have that sense of redemption. Without that, we're, again, trying to do this on our own. We're trying to sling stones of our own strength, basically, to use a Davidic example. But I think the point to all this is, and the writer of Hebrews is trying to say, you don't trust the strength in your arm. You have faith in the God behind the stone. That's what it takes. David couldn't have slung that stone of his own strength hard enough to kill that man.
And you have to be willing to put yourself in a position to do things, to accomplish things that you're not accomplishing, really, that you're accomplishing through God's power. Yep. So, as we're going to finish up the season, the last 4 episodes talking about my book, What's the Plan? And if people ask what the plan is, it is you're fulfilling God's purpose for your life. And so, and that's probably the most heroic thing any of us can do.
Absolutely.
So that's the challenge. And so we saw the challenges that all of these heroes have taken. And so we have to identify in our own lives how our arc comes into play and what tests that we will encounter and how we'll deal with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm excited for what's coming next.
Yep. Okay, then. Great. Good stuff. And so anything wrap up thoughts? I think we kind of wrapped up heroes well. And so we're ready to move on to the next stuff. And that'll be these next 4 episodes. And we'll talk a little bit about the next season. So good deal. Thanks, everyone. Check us on the website, the blog, and whatever, and let us know how much you're enjoying it.
Absolutely.
All right. Talk to you later.